On the afternoon of the 15th of July, 1982, two boys on bicycles were riding along the banks of the Green River in King County, Washington. The river moved slowly that day, the water murky and unremarkable, winding through an industrial stretch of Kent where slaughterhouses stood alongside rail yards. The boys had come looking for something to do on a summer afternoon. What they found instead would mark the beginning of the longest and most devastating serial murder investigation in American history. Caught against a piling near the Peck Bridge, partially submerged and tangled in debris, was the body of a young woman. She was 16 years old. Her name was Wendy Lee Caulfield, and she had been missing for exactly 1 week. Wendy had grown up hard. Her parents divorced when she was young, and she bounced between her mother Virginia's care and various state facilities throughout her adolescence. The family struggled financially, living at times in low-income housing, at other times in tents, picking blackberries in the fields during summer to afford food. A psychologist who evaluated Wendy noted that she was depressed, angry about her life. She was incapable of changing things for the better, the report said. Those words would prove tragically prophetic. By the summer of 1982, Wendy had run away repeatedly. She had been arrested, served time in juvenile detention, and eventually ended up working the streets around the SeaTac Strip, a stretch of Pacific Highway South that ran near the Seattle-Tacoma International Airport. It was a dangerous place for anyone, but especially for a teenager with no safety net and no one watching over her. On July 8, Wendy left a state receiving home in Tacoma. No one would see her alive again. When her body was pulled from the Green River, 1 week later, wrapped around her neck were her own James jeans twisted into a ligature. Years later, a researcher going through case files would pause on those jeans, recognizing them as the same style she had worn as a child growing up in the same area. "There are some things that just connect you," she would say. "It can bring tears to my eyes. Actually, just thinking about it, as I visualize those jeans, and just how she was killed." The discovery of Wendy Caulfield did not immediately signal to investigators that they were facing something extraordinary. Young women went missing from the SeaTac Strip with unfortunate regularity. Many were involved in prostitution, and their disappearances often went unreported for days or weeks. Some were runaways, whose families had lost contact with them long before. The transient nature of their lives made them difficult to track. The SeaTac Strip itself was a world unto itself in the early 1982s. Pacific Highway South ran for miles through unincorporated King County, lined with motels that rented by the hour fast food restaurants and truck stops. At night, young women walked the sidewalks, getting into cars with men they didn't know, hoping to earn enough to pay for another night's shelter or another fix. It was dangerous work, and everyone who did it knew the risks. But for many, the risks of the street seemed preferable to whatever they had left behind. The area near Seattle-Tacoma International Airport had become a magnet for this kind of activity precisely because of its transient nature. Travelers came and went constantly. Nobody knew their neighbors. The sprawl of strip malls and parking lots created countless anonymous spaces where transactions could occur unobserved. For a predator looking for vulnerable targets, it was ideal hunting ground. Investigators would later learn that the man they were hunting understood this terrain intimately. He had grown up in the area, knew every back road and wooded lot, every place where a body might be concealed. He drove the strip regularly, often several times a day, always watching, always calculating. But within a month of finding Wendy, the bodies began to accumulate. On August 12, A worker at a Kent slaughterhouse named Frank Lennard spotted something floating in the Green River just yards from where he worked. The remains were identified as Deborah Lynn Bonner, 23 years old, who had disappeared on July 25. 3 days later, on August 15, two more bodies surfaced in the river, weighed down with rocks that had shifted loose. Marcia Faye Chapman, 31, a single mother of three who had turned to sex work to support her children, and Cynthia Jean Hines, 17, known to her friends as Cookie, who had been working the streets since she was 14. That same day, searchers found a fourth victim on the riverbank nearby. Her name was Opal Charmaine Mills. She was 16 years old. Opal had last been seen at a public phone booth off the SeaTac Strip near 192nd Street. She and Cynthia Hines had known each other, had worked together painting apartments for a private contractor. They were friends trying to survive on the margins, and they died within days of each other, their bodies left in the same stretch of river. The connection between victims would become a recurring pattern. Some knew each other from the streets. Some had worked the same corners. Some had likely encountered the same man in his truck, not knowing that their friends had already met him and never returned. The killer was methodical, returning to the same hunting grounds, selecting victims from the same vulnerable population, disposing of their bodies in locations he knew well. The Green River itself seemed almost cruelly symbolic. It wound through the industrial lowlands of King County, past factories and warehouses and forgotten patches of woodland, carrying with it the refuse of the region's commerce. To dump bodies there was to treat human beings as waste, as something to be discarded and forgotten. The killer understood this. He knew that these women were not likely to be missed. Not quickly, not with the kind of urgency that might bring investigators to his door. The King County Sheriff's Office could no longer treat these as isolated incidents. Someone was hunting young women along the SeaTac Strip. In the weeks that followed, a task force was assembled under the direction of Major Bob Kraske. A young detective named Dave Riekert, who had caught the initial cases, was assigned to lead the investigation. The media had already given the unknown killer a name that would echo through the next 2 decades. The Green River Killer. Anyone who has spent time in the Pacific Northwest knows how the landscape there can shift between the ordinary and the ominous. The dense forests, the persistent gray skies, the rain-soaked earth that seems to hold secrets just beneath the surface. In the fall of 1982, women stopped walking alone. Families warned their daughters. And still the disappearances continued. The SeaTac Strip became a geography of fear. Women who worked there developed their own systems for staying safe. Or, at least, safer. They memorized license plates. They checked in with friends before getting into cars. They tried to identify which Johns were regulars, which ones had reputations, which ones made them uneasy. But no system could protect them from a killer who looked ordinary, who seemed safe, who had perfected the art of appearing harmless. Among those working the strip, word spread about the Green River Killer. Women warned each other about suspicious vehicles, about men who seemed off, about areas where bodies had been found. They knew they were in danger. They knew someone was hunting them. But for many, the economic realities that had brought them to the strip in the first place left them with few alternatives. The community that formed among these women was fragile but real. They looked out for each other when they could. They shared information. Some of the survivors would carry the weight of those losses for the rest of their lives, wondering if they could have done something differently, if they could have warned someone, if they could have saved a friend who climbed into the wrong truck. By the end of 982. 12 women had been linked to the Green River Killer. By 1984, the number would approach 40. The victims shared certain vulnerabilities. Many were involved in sex work. Many were teenagers or in their early 20s. Many came from difficult backgrounds, from broken homes, from foster care, from the margins of society where their absence might not be immediately noticed. The killer seemed to understand this. He targeted women who he thought might not be reported missing right away, or might never be reported missing at all. He understood that society's attention is not distributed equally. But not all of his victims fit this profile. Carol Ann Christensen, 21, was last seen leaving the Barn Door Tavern on Pacific Avenue South on the 3rd of May, 1983. She had been having lunch there and planned to return that night for her shift as a waitress. Carol Ann was not a sex worker. She was a young mother separated from her husband, but determined to make things work for her daughter Sarah. Her absolute pride and joy. Carol Ann was a registered member of the Blackfeet tribe and had moved to Washington from Grays Harbor in 1969. She happened to be walking in an area where the Green River Killer was known to operate. That was enough to make her a target. The inclusion of Carol Ann Christensen among the victims challenged the narrative that Ridgway was killing only sex workers. He was killing vulnerable women, whatever their circumstances. The SeaTac Strip was his hunting ground, and anyone who crossed his path at the wrong moment was at risk. Similarly, some victims had been involved in sex work only briefly or intermittently, driven by circumstances rather than choice. They might have turned to it during periods of desperate need, intending to stop once they got back on their feet. The label prostitute, applied so freely in news coverage, obscured these nuances. It flattened complex human stories into simple categories, making it easier to dismiss the victims as somehow complicit in their own deaths. Marcia Chapman had been a single mother trying to feed 3 children. She was 31 years old, an Arizona native who had moved to Washington and found herself turning to sex work to support her family. Her friends called her tiny. She refused to work with a pimp, preferring to maintain whatever independence she could in circumstances that offered little. On the 2nd of August 1982, her mother reported her missing. Marcia told kids she was going to store. Her mother said in the missing person report, "Never returned. Never has done anything like this. Good mother." Those last 2 words carry a weight that echoes through the decades. Good mother. Marcia Chapman was doing what she had to do to keep her children fed and housed. The circumstances that led her to the SeaTac Strip were not a reflection of her character, but of the limited options available to a single mother without resources. She was trying to survive, and the system that should have protected her instead looked away. Opal Mills had painted apartments with her friend Cynthia Hines, the 2 of them working side by side before both were taken within days of each other. Opal was 16, barely old enough to drive, not old enough to vote or drink legally, but somehow old enough to be working the streets and dying there. Her friend Cynthia had been working as a sex worker since she was 14. Her father, Robert Williams, last saw her alive on the 10th of August, 1982, during one of her shifts at a South Seattle barbecue restaurant. She still was a human being, her brother Terry said later. She still had family that cared and loved her, just like all the other ones had family that cared and loved them. Deborah Bonner had traveled up and down the West Coast, with her boyfriend calling her mother regularly to say, "I love you." She drove a 1972 maroon Thunderbird with a white top. "That car was Debbie," he said. "She was class all the way." The couple had lived out of various motels as they worked what those in the life called the circuit, moving between cities where the money was better or the police pressure was lighter. Despite everything, Deborah maintained close relationships with her family. She called her mother a couple of times a week to check in and stay in touch, always ending the calls with "I love you" and "Tell Dad I love him." Each of these women had people who cared about them. The investigation that followed their deaths was marked by determination, by exhaustion, and by failures that would haunt everyone involved. The task force operated under enormous pressure from the beginning. The body count was climbing, the media attention was intense, and the public was terrified. Families of missing women called constantly, desperate for any information about their daughters and sisters. Politicians demanded results. And the investigators, many of whom had never worked a serial murder case before, were learning on the job. The task force eventually grew to include dozens of detectives, evidence technicians, and support staff. They interviewed thousands of potential witnesses and suspects. They collected mountains of evidence from crime scenes and dump sites. They consulted with profilers from the FBI, including Special Agent John Douglas, who developed a psychological portrait of the likely killer. They even met with incarcerated serial killer Ted Bundy, who offered his own theories about the Green River Killer's behavior and motivations. Bundy, sitting in a Florida prison, awaiting execution for his own string of murders, suggested that the killer was likely revisiting the dump sites to have sex with his victims' bodies. He recommended that if police found a fresh grave, they should stake it out and wait for the killer to return. It was advice that proved accurate, though it came from a source whose credibility was forever tainted by his own crimes. The investigation consumed enormous resources. Over the years, it would cost an estimated $15 million and tens of thousands of staff hours. Detectives worked overtime week after week, sifting through tips, following leads, processing evidence. Some burned out and had to be reassigned. Others stayed on the case for years, unable to let it go, even as it took a toll on their health and their families. In late 1982, the task force focused intensely on a Lacey cab driver named Melvin Wayne Foster. Foster fit the emerging profile. He had failed a polygraph examination administered by the task force. Investigators became convinced they had found their man. They were wrong. While the task force conducted surveillance on Foster, women continued to disappear. The killer was still out there, still hunting. And the investigators' certainty had blinded them to other possibilities. It would take months for them to acknowledge their mistake. Months during which the real killer operated freely. This pattern of false leads and investigative dead ends would repeat itself throughout the case. At various points, the task force arrested or focused on at least 4 different suspects. Each time believing they had found the Green River Killer. Each time, eventually forced to admit they had not. Every false arrest was another delay. Every delay meant more victims. The year 1983 was particularly devastating. More women disappeared that year than in any other. The killer had found his rhythm, had developed a routine that allowed him to abduct, murder, and dispose of bodies with terrible efficiency. Some weeks, multiple women vanished. Their remains would be found scattered across King County, in wooded areas and vacant lots, along highways and near rivers. By the end of 1983, the official victim count had climbed to 12. But investigators suspected the true number was much higher. Many women who went missing were never officially reported. Others were reported, but not connected to the Green River case. The killer was operating in the gaps of the system, exploiting the same invisibility that made his victims vulnerable in the first place. The women who disappeared during this period came from backgrounds that were heartbreakingly similar. Terry Renee Milligan was 16 when she vanished. Mary Bridget Meehan was 18 and pregnant. Deborah Lorraine Estes was 15, had been sexually assaulted, and was working with police to file charges against her rapist when she disappeared. She had eagerly agreed to testify in court. She never got the chance. Deborah Estes was young, capricious, and loved horses according to those who knew her. She had many friends who adored her. She was using the street name Betty Lorraine when she vanished, trying to build a case against the man who had attacked her. The police who were working with her on that case would later learn that she had become a victim of an even more dangerous predator. The task force was overwhelmed. Despite the resources devoted to the investigation, they could not seem to get ahead of the killer. Tips poured in by the thousands, but most led nowhere. Suspects were investigated and cleared. Meanwhile, the bodies kept appearing. On the 30th of April 1983, an 18-year-old named Marie Malvar got into a dark pickup truck on Pacific Highway South. Her boyfriend, Robert Woods, watched from nearby. He saw the truck, noted its patches of primer, tried to follow as it headed north into a motel parking lot, and then back out again. When the truck turned east on South 216th Street, Woods lost the trail at a traffic signal. Marie never came home. What happened next represents one of the most painful what-ifs in the entire case. Marie's father, Jose Malvar, refused to give up. Together with his family and Robert Woods, he began scouring the neighborhood where they had lost sight of the truck. Within days, they found it parked in front of a house in Des Moines, 1 block off 216th Street. The family called the police. A Des Moines detective went to the house and interviewed the resident, a 34-year-old truck painter named Gary Ridgway. Ridgway denied knowing anything about Marie Malvar's disappearance. The detective left satisfied. That house where the Malvar family had tracked the truck was where Marie had been killed. Years later, Ridgway would confess that as he spoke with the detective, he stood against a fence in his yard to conceal the scratches Marie had left on his inner arm as she fought for her life. After the detective departed, Ridgway burned the scratches with battery acid to disguise them, then returned to the woods where he had dumped Marie's body and buried her. Marie's father never stopped looking for his daughter. There were days he didn't come home, her brother, Jose Jr., would later recall. He'd just keep driving and driving. Some days he'd drive by Ridgway's house and wait to see if my sister came out. Pretty vivacious. Marie was never seen again. A handful of her bones would not be found until 2003, when Ridgway finally led detectives to the site as part of a plea agreement. "I know every time he looks at that scar, he remembers my sister," Jose Jr. said of the marks Marie left on Ridgway's arm. "At least she got that. At least she didn't go down without a fight." The Malvar family's tip did not go entirely unnoticed. It brought Ridgway to the attention of the Green River Task Force. In 1984, he was interviewed multiple times and agreed to take a polygraph test. He passed. The polygraph operator concluded that Ridgway was being truthful when he denied involvement in the killings. Based on this result, investigators moved on to other suspects. The case against Ridgway seemed to have reached a dead end. This would prove to be one of the most catastrophic errors of the entire investigation. At the time Ridgway passed that polygraph, he had already killed more than 40 women. He would go on to kill at least 6 more. The polygraph is not a lie detector despite its popular name. It measures physiological responses, changes in breathing and blood pressure and perspiration, that examiners interpret as indicators of deception. But the scientific community has never accepted the polygraph as a reliable measure of truthfulness. Some people fail polygraphs while telling the truth. Others pass while lying. Gary Ridgway, was apparently one of the latter. The same polygraph operator who cleared Ridgway had earlier deemed Melvin Wayne Foster deceptive. Foster, the innocent cab driver, had failed his test, drawing intense investigative attention that distracted from other leads. The unreliability of the polygraph had created a double injustice. An innocent man was suspected, while a guilty one walked free. When asked years later how he managed to pass Ridgway's, attorney said his client didn't do anything special. He just relaxed. But then he is a unique individual. The phrase chills anyone who reads it. Ridgway was able to sit in a room with investigators deny murdering dozens of women and remain calm enough that his physiological responses betrayed nothing. Whether this reflected sociopathy, practiced deception, or simply an ability to compartmentalize that most people would find impossible, the result was the same. The polygraph had given Ridgway a clean bill of health, and the investigation moved on without him. Other suspects continued to draw attention. The task force investigated people whose names had come up in tips, men who fit the developing profile, anyone who seemed even tangentially connected to the world where the victims had lived. But none of them was the Green River Killer. The real killer continued driving the same roads, visiting the same areas, selecting victims from the same vulnerable population. There were close calls, women who survived encounters with Ridgway and reported them to police, tips that mentioned his name specifically, evidence that placed him in proximity to victims. But nothing quite connected. The pieces were there, scattered across thousands of pages of reports and evidence logs, but no one could put them together into a coherent picture. In 1987, investigators obtained a search warrant for Gary Ridgway's home. The task force continued its work, but by the late 1980s, the killings appeared to have stopped, or at least slowed dramatically. County Executive Tim Hill disbanded the official task force in 1989. A handful of detectives remained assigned to the case, then just one or two, then eventually only one. That detective was Tom Jensen. Jensen had joined the task force in 1984, shortly after attending his first Green River crime scene. The experience changed him. Even decades later, he had trouble speaking about it. A farmer's dog had brought home what appeared to be a human bone, and the search that followed led to skeletal remains in a wooded area near some Little League fields. The victim was a young woman somewhere between 12 and 18 years old. Her name was unknown. The scene stayed with Jensen. The scattered bones, the remnants of clothing, the nameless victim, who had been someone's daughter. This was not abstract violence, not statistics in a case file. This was a real person who had walked and talked and dreamed. Jensen spent years studying the evidence, interviewing witnesses, following leads that went nowhere. He was the one who noticed back in 1984 that several women had disappeared while Melvin Wayne Foster was under surveillance, proving that Foster could not be the killer. It was a crucial observation, but it meant the investigation was back to square one. The realization that they had been pursuing the wrong man must have been devastating. All those resources, all that attention, focused on someone who was not responsible, while the real killer continued his work. But Jensen did not give up. He took what he had learned and kept going. Through the late 1980s and all through the 1000s, he cataloged evidence, tracked missing persons reports, and refused to let the case go cold even as others moved on to new assignments. The case files grew thick with leads that had been investigated and closed, suspects who had been cleared, evidence that could not quite be connected. Jensen knew all of it. He knew which victims had been found where, which ones remained missing, which families still called to check on the case. He carried the weight of their expectations, even when he had nothing new to tell them. Some cold case detectives burn out from the frustration. Others find a kind of grim determination. Jensen was in the latter category. He believed the case could be solved. He believed technology would eventually catch up with the killer. He just had to be ready when it did. In 1987, investigators obtained a search warrant for Gary Ridgway's home. They found no physical evidence linking him to the victims, but they did obtain something that would prove invaluable 14 years later: a saliva sample. The 1987 search was triggered by a woman who had survived an encounter with Ridgway. She had given detectives a description and identified him in a photo lineup. Her account, combined with the other tips that had accumulated over the years, was enough to convince a judge to issue a warrant. Detectives went through Ridgway's house, methodically looking for anything that might connect him to the victims. They collected carpet fibers and ropes. They photographed rooms and examined vehicles. They searched for trophies, for evidence, for anything that might break the case open. They found nothing definitive. Ridgway had been meticulous in covering his tracks. He later admitted that he had cleaned up after his crimes, had disposed of evidence, had taken steps to ensure that investigators would find nothing to link him to the murders. His wife, who would later express shock at the revelation of his crimes, had noticed that their house had no carpet when she moved in. Detectives would eventually tell her that Ridgway had probably wrapped a body in it. But the search did yield one crucial piece of evidence: a saliva sample. Investigators had Ridgway chew on a piece of gauze, collecting his DNA for comparison to evidence found on victims. It was a routine procedure, standard practice in a murder investigation. They had no way of knowing in 1987 how important that sample would become. At the time, DNA profiling technology was in its infancy. The science simply wasn't advanced enough to generate usable results from the degraded samples found on victims' bodies. The techniques that existed required larger, better preserved samples than what investigators had available. So Ridgway's saliva sample was logged into evidence and stored away. For 14 years, that sample sat in an evidence locker. For 14 years, Ridgway continued to live his ordinary life, going to work at the Kenworth factory, coming home to his wife, driving the same roads where he had once hunted victims. For 14 years, the answer to the Green River case was locked away, waiting for science to catch up. And then they waited. The years passed slowly for the families of victims. Some held out hope that their daughters or sisters might still be alive somewhere, might one day walk through the door. Others struggled to accept the ambiguous grief of not knowing. The psychological toll of this uncertainty is difficult to overstate. When someone dies, there are rituals and processes that help survivors begin to grieve: a funeral, a burial, a headstone to visit. But when someone simply vanishes, when their fate remains unknown for years or decades, the grief has nowhere to go. It becomes a constant presence. Families of missing women lived in a perpetual state of limbo. Every phone call might be the one that brought news, good or bad. Every knock at the door might be a detective with answers. Or it might be nothing. Most often, it was nothing. The waiting continued year after year, while the investigation slowly wound down and the world moved on. Jose Malvar kept a picture of Marie in his wallet. Every August on her birthday, he celebrated with a piece of cake. "Deep in my heart, I know she's still alive," he said in 2001, before Ridgway's arrest. "She's out there. I never give up until they find her body." The hope that sustains such statements is also their cruelty. Jose Malvar had tracked the killer's truck to his house 18 years before that interview. He had done everything a father could do. And still the police had not believed him. And still his daughter remained missing. And still he celebrated her birthday every year with a piece of cake for a girl who was already dead. Other families were less fortunate. Some victims remained unidentified for decades. Their remains labeled only with numbers: Bones 10, Bones 17, Bones 20. These were young women who had slipped through every safety net, whose families had lost track of them years before their deaths, who became Jane Does in a growing file of unsolved cases. For these unknown victims, there was no one to wait for answers, no one to demand justice, no one to remember their birthdays or keep their photos in a wallet. They existed only as numbered entries in a case file, remains stored in evidence lockers, mysteries that might never be solved. The investigators who remained on the case carried their own burden. Tom Jensen spent years with the Green River murders, knew the victims' faces better than some members of their own families, felt personally responsible for bringing their killer to justice. Other detectives cycled through, spent months or years on the case, then moved on to other assignments, carrying the weight of an unsolved investigation with them. Dave Reichert, the young detective who had caught the initial cases, eventually rose through the ranks to become King County Sheriff. But he never forgot the Green River victims. He spoke with their families. He attended memorial services. Some people ask whether the investigators could have done more, whether the case might have been solved sooner if different decisions had been made. The answer is almost certainly yes. The evidence was there. The suspect was identified early. The failures were systemic, institutional, the result of limited technology and limited resources, and perhaps limited imagination about who these victims were and how much their lives mattered. But it's also true that the investigators worked within the constraints of their time. DNA technology barely existed in the early 1982. The polygraph was still widely trusted. Resources for investigating serial murders were limited. Many of the failures that seem obvious in retrospect were invisible at the time. The mother of Wendy Caulfield, the first victim found in the Green River, carried her own burden. She had struggled to control her daughter, had watched Wendy run away time after time, had eventually concluded that the life at home could not provide Wendy with a safe place to grow up. "That's why I don't have any pain in my heart now that she's gone," Virginia Caulfield said in one interview. A statement that sounds harsh until you understand the years of helplessness and fear that preceded it. Some people ask themselves why no one noticed these women, why their disappearances didn't spark the kind of urgent response that other missing persons cases receive. The answer is uncomfortable but unavoidable. Their lives existed at the margins. Many were involved in prostitution. Many struggled with addiction. Many had histories with law enforcement. When they vanished, the systems that might have protected them often looked the other way. Coverage at the time seemed to place blame on the victims themselves, whether intended or not. One Seattle Times article about Wendy Caulfield editorialized that getting murdered was just about as predictable as anything in her sad life, as if a 16-year-old from a struggling family had somehow brought this fate upon herself. This attitude permeated much of the early coverage. Journalists described the victims primarily in terms of their involvement in prostitution, as if their occupation defined their entire existence. The word prostitute appeared in headlines and lead paragraphs, reducing complex human beings to a single descriptor that carried enormous social stigma. Rarely did the coverage explore who these women had been before circumstances led them to the streets. Rarely did journalists interview their families, their friends, the people who had known them as children or classmates or neighbors. The victims became abstractions, interchangeable figures in a horror story, rather than individuals with their own dreams and fears and hopes. The language mattered. When victims are described primarily in terms of criminal activity, it becomes easier for the public to dismiss their deaths as somehow less tragic, less worthy of outrage. Someone reading about the murder of a prostitute might feel differently than they would reading about the murder of a teenage girl who loved dancing and had a family that adored her. But both descriptions might apply to the same person. This is not to say that journalists acted with malicious intent. Many were simply following conventions of crime reporting that existed at the time, conventions that prioritized certain details over others. But the cumulative effect was to dehumanize the victims in the public imagination, to make them seem somehow complicit in their own deaths. The families noticed. They saw how their daughters and sisters were described in the news, and it added another layer of pain to their grief. Not only had they lost someone they loved, but that person's memory was being reduced to a single word that carried such judgment. The attitudes began to shift as the years passed and the body count grew. The investigation operated under constraints that a case involving victims from different circumstances might not have faced. Funding was never unlimited. Public pressure ebbed and flowed, and the killer, whoever he was, continued to evade capture. The breakthrough finally came at the turn of the millennium. By 2001, DNA profiling technology had advanced dramatically. Techniques that were impossible or unreliable in the 1,980 seconds had become standard tools of forensic investigation. Smaller samples could yield usable profiles. Degraded evidence could be analyzed with greater precision. The science that made this possible had been developing for decades. In 1984, the same year Ridgway passed his polygraph test, a British geneticist named Alec Jeffreys had discovered a method for identifying individuals based on their DNA. The technique, which he called DNA fingerprinting, revolutionized forensic science. By the late 1,980 seconds, DNA evidence was being admitted in American courts. By the 1,990 seconds, it had become a standard tool in criminal investigations. But the technology continued to improve. Early DNA tests required relatively large, well-preserved samples. The evidence collected from Green River victims, much of it degraded after years of exposure to the elements, could not be analyzed with these early techniques. It would take another generation of scientific advancement before the samples would yield results. The breakthrough came with the development of short tandem repeat analysis, a technique that could generate DNA profiles from much smaller and more degraded samples than previous methods. By the late 1,990 seconds, crime labs across the country were adopting this technology, reopening cold cases that had been unsolvable with older techniques. Dave Reichert, who had become King County Sheriff in 1997, pushed to have the Green River evidence re-examined using the new technology. The case had never been officially closed, but it had languished for years without active investigation. Reichert wanted to change that. He remembered the victims. He remembered the families. He believed that with new tools the case might finally be solved. Tom Jensen, who had never given up on the case, pressed to have the old evidence retested. The saliva sample collected from Gary Ridgway in 1987, the semen recovered from victims' bodies nearly 2 decades earlier. The results were unequivocal. Ridgway's DNA matched samples from multiple victims. The saliva sample collected in 1987 was compared to semen recovered from 3 victims, 2 found in the river in 1982 and another from a dump site in 1983. The match was definitive. After nearly 2 decades of uncertainty, investigators finally had their man. The news spread quickly through the small community of detectives and prosecutors who had worked the case over the years. Some had retired. Some had moved on to other assignments. Some had never stopped thinking about the Green River victims. Now finally there was an answer. The arrest was planned carefully. Investigators did not want to tip off Ridgway, did not want to give him any chance to flee or destroy evidence. They gathered their team and drove to the Kenworth truck factory in Renton, Washington. On the 30th of November, 2001, nearly 20 years after Wendy Caulfield's body was found in the Green River, King County, detectives drove to the Kenworth truck factory in Renton, where Ridgway had worked as a spray painter decades. They found him leaving the building with his lunch bucket, heading toward his truck. When they asked if he was Gary Ridgway, he said yes. When they told him he was under arrest for the murder of 4 women, he said okay and handed them his lunch bucket. The ordinariness of his reaction was chilling. Here was a man who had just been told he was under arrest for multiple murders, and his response was as casual as if he had been asked for directions. There was no protest, no denial, no visible emotion, just a simple okay and a handing over of his lunch. In the days that followed, investigators searched Ridgway's home and workplace, looking for evidence that might connect him to additional victims. They found carpet samples and fibers that would be analyzed for traces of the murdered women. They found records and documents that would help establish timelines. They found the infrastructure of an ordinary life that had concealed 2 decades of killing. The initial charges named 4 victims: Marcia Chapman, Opal Mills, Cynthia Hines, and Carol Ann Christensen. But everyone involved knew this was just the beginning. The DNA evidence was overwhelming for these 4 cases, but investigators suspected Ridgway was responsible for many more deaths. The arrest was a vindication for investigators who had spent years pursuing leads that went nowhere. But it also raised painful questions about the failures that had allowed Ridgway to evade justice for so long. An NBC News investigation conducted years later revealed that key microscopic evidence found on early victims had never been properly analyzed. Tiny spheres of spray paint were discovered on the clothing of Ridgway's first victim and on at least 7 others. The paint was a unique industrial formula used at the Kenworth truck factory where Ridgway worked. If that evidence had been tested in the 1,980 seconds, a renowned trace evidence expert named Skip Palahniuk, brought in to analyze evidence after Ridgway's arrest, said he could have performed the same analysis using an infrared microscope back in the 1,980 seconds. He had visited the Washington State Crime Lab in 1985 to train staff in discovering microscopic trace evidence. The director had mentioned potentially bringing him into the Green River case. It never happened. The paint spheres were a smoking gun that sat unexamined for 2 decades. They were microscopic, invisible to the naked eye. But they were there on victim after victim, a trail of evidence leading directly to the Kenworth truck factory, where Ridgway worked. The technology to identify them existed. The expertise to analyze them was available. But the connection was never made. Why not? The answers are complicated. The crime lab was overwhelmed with evidence from multiple cases. Resources were limited. DNA analysis, which seemed more promising, took priority. And perhaps there was an assumption that trace evidence from industrial paint would be too common to be useful. Whatever the reasons, the paint evidence was overlooked until after Ridgway's arrest. When Palahniuk finally analyzed the paint spheres in 2002 and 2003, he found a specific type that was not sold to the public and was used on a large scale in the Seattle area, only at the Kenworth Truck Factory during the early 1980 seconds. The match was unmistakable. Ridgway had carried traces of his workplace on his clothing, and those traces had transferred to his victims' bodies and belongings. The discovery of the paint evidence helped convince Ridgway to accept a plea bargain. Faced with DNA evidence linking him to multiple victims and trace evidence placing him at the crime scenes, the forensic case against him was overwhelming. 20 years passed. The paint evidence sat untested, and Gary Ridgway kept killing. This is not to diminish the dedication of the investigators who worked the case, many of whom sacrificed their health, their marriages, and their peace of mind in pursuit of the killer. Dave Reichert, who led the initial investigation and later became King County Sheriff, remained emotionally connected to the families throughout the decades. He gave all of himself to the family members, said Murdy Winston, whose daughter Tracy disappeared in 1983. But dedication alone could not overcome the systemic failures, the limited resources, the technological constraints, and the institutional blind spots that allowed Ridgway to operate for so long. The case exposed fissures in how law enforcement prioritized certain victims over others, how investigative resources were allocated, and how easily crucial evidence could slip through the cracks. Following his arrest, Ridgway initially proclaimed his innocence. Through his attorneys, he claimed he had dated, but hadn't killed the victims linked to him through DNA. It was a claim that strained credibility given the evidence, but it signaled that Ridgway was not going to cooperate easily. The prosecution faced a difficult decision. They had DNA evidence linking Ridgway to a handful of victims, but proving his guilt in the dozens of other suspected cases would be much harder. A lengthy trial might result in convictions for some murders, while others remained officially unsolved. The families of those unsolved cases would never know for certain what had happened to their loved ones. Over the following months, prosecutors and defense attorneys engaged in negotiations that would ultimately produce one of the most controversial plea agreements in American legal history. The deal was controversial. In exchange for life imprisonment without parole, Ridgway would confess to all his murders and lead investigators to the remains of still missing victims. He would never face execution. For families who had waited decades for justice, the prospect of sparing their daughter's killer's life was almost unbearable. The decision was agonizing for prosecutors. On one hand, the death penalty seemed like the only proportionate response to crimes of this magnitude. On the other hand, the families needed answers. They needed to know what had happened to their daughters. They needed to find their remains and give them proper burials. Only Ridgway could provide that information, and he would only provide it in exchange for his life. King County prosecuting attorney Norm Maleng spent months wrestling with the decision. He consulted with families, with investigators, with legal experts. He weighed the competing values of justice and closure, of punishment and truth. King County prosecuting attorney Norm Maleng explained his reasoning. "We could have gone forward with 7 counts, but that is all we could have ever hoped to solve. At the end of that trial, whatever the outcome, there would have been lingering doubts about the rest of these crimes. This agreement was the avenue to the truth." Maleng acknowledged the weight of his decision. Gary Ridgway does not deserve our mercy. The mercy provided by today's resolution is directed not at Ridgway but toward the families who have suffered so much. Over the following months, Ridgway participated in detailed interrogations, confessing to 48 murders in King County between 1982 and 1998. He led detectives to the remains of several victims who had never been found, including Marie Malvar, whose bones were finally recovered 20 years after her father first tracked Ridgway's truck to his house. The videotaped confessions offered a disturbing window into Ridgway's mind. He spoke of his crimes with an emotional flatness that investigators found chilling. "I killed so many women I have a hard time keeping them straight," he said. "Most of the time I killed them the first time I met them, and I do not have a good memory for their faces." He explained his targeting of sex workers with cold calculation. "They were easy to pick up without being noticed. I knew they would not be reported missing right away and might never be reported missing. I picked prostitutes because I thought I could kill as many of them as I wanted without getting caught." It's difficult not to imagine what his victims felt in their final moments. The terror and betrayal of realizing that the man who seemed ordinary, who might have even shown them a picture of his son to earn their trust, was about to end their lives. Some fought back. Marie Malvar left scars. Others never had the chance. The confessions revealed details that investigators had never known. Ridgway described his methods, his routines, his thought processes. He explained how he selected victims, how he gained their trust, how he avoided detection. He spoke of returning to dump sites to have sex with the bodies of women he had killed, a detail he had hidden until after his sentencing. He also revealed the location of victims who had never been found. Over the following months, search teams would recover remains at sites Ridgway identified. The bones of Marie Malvar were found in September 2003, 20 years after her father had tracked the killer's truck to his house. For the families, the confessions were a form of torture. They provided answers, yes, but those answers came with horrific details that would haunt them forever. Some families chose to read the transcripts. Others could not bring themselves to do so. Either choice carried its own burden. On the 18th of December, 2003, Gary Ridgway stood before King County Superior Court Judge Richard A. Jones for sentencing. The courtroom was packed with family members of victims who had waited years for this moment. Some had traveled from across the country. Some had been waiting since the 1,980 seconds. All of them carried the weight of grief and rage and hoped that this day might finally bring some measure of closure. One by one, prosecutors read the names of the dead: Wendy Lee Caulfield, Deborah Lynn Bonner, Marcia Faye Chapman, Cynthia Jean Hines, Opal Charmaine Mills. 48 names in all. To each charge, Ridgway responded with the same monotone word: guilty. Some family members wept. Some stared straight ahead. Some left the courtroom shaking with rage. And some forgave. The sentencing hearing lasted for hours, as family members were given the opportunity to address Ridgway directly. Many had waited 20 years or more for this chance. Their statements ranged from expressions of raw grief to attempts at reconciliation to furious condemnations. One victim's child spoke of what it meant to grow up without a mother. "I was only 5 when my mother died, and when my dad told me that she was never coming home." The words carried the weight of 2 decades of absence, of milestones missed, of a childhood shadowed by loss. Jose Malvar Jr. confronted the man who had killed his sister Marie. He spoke of the family's search for her, of his father's tireless efforts to find the truck, of the years of not knowing. The scars Marie had left on Ridgway's arm were in a way the only victory the family could claim. At least she didn't go down without a fight. Virginia Graham, sister of Deborah Estes, spoke of her sister's youth and promise. Carol Estes, Deborah's mother, described the decades of uncertainty, the hope that had gradually faded into acceptance. Both women had spent years wondering what had happened to the teenager who had disappeared, while trying to help police build a case against her rapist. "I forgive you," one relative told Ridgway directly. "You can't hold me anymore. I'm through with you." Others felt differently. "If it were up to me," said Deborah York, aunt of victim Cynthia Hines. The divergent responses reflected the impossible position families found themselves in. Forgiveness offered a path to peace, a way to release the anger that had poisoned their lives for years. But for many, forgiveness felt like a betrayal of their murdered loved ones, a concession to the man who had stolen so much from them. Ridgway sat through the hours of statements, showing little visible emotion. He cried briefly at one point, a display that struck many observers as calculated rather than genuine. This was a man who had killed dozens of women without apparent remorse. His tears seemed more like performance than penitence. The sentence was 48 consecutive life terms without the possibility of parole, plus a fine of $480,000. A 49th life sentence would be added in 2011 when the remains of Rebecca Marrero were finally discovered. But even then, the case was not truly closed. The plea agreement included a provision that Ridgway would plead guilty to any future cases in King County, where his confession could be corroborated by reliable evidence. This meant the investigation would continue, that new evidence might lead to additional charges, that the final accounting of his crimes was not yet complete. In the years following the sentencing, investigators continued to search for missing victims. They followed leads that Ridgway had provided, examined sites he had identified, and tested evidence using ever-improving forensic technology. Some searches yielded results. Others came up empty. Ridgway proved to be an unreliable narrator of his own crimes. He provided information, led investigators to some dump sites, but also seemed to enjoy the attention and control that his cooperation gave him. On at least one occasion, he led investigators on what turned out to be a wild goose chase, promising information that proved worthless. The manipulation continued from behind bars. Ridgway seemed to understand that his knowledge of the victims' locations gave him leverage, gave him a way to remain relevant even from his prison cell. He doled out information strategically, keeping some secrets close, hinting at others without revealing them fully. For decades after Ridgway's conviction, families of victims waited for identification of remains that had been found, but never named. The women known only as Bones 10, Bones 17, and Bones 20 haunted investigators and families alike. Silent reminders that some questions remained unanswered. These unknown victims represented perhaps the saddest aspect of the entire case. Not only had they been murdered, but their identities had been erased. Their families, if they had any, did not know to search for them. They existed only as numbered entries in a case file. Forensic anthropologist Catherine Taylor spent years working on these cases. She collaborated with investigators, analyzed remains, submitted evidence to databases, hoping for matches that might reveal who these young women had been. For decades, the work yielded nothing. No hits, no leads, no names. In 2021, the King County Sheriff's Office announced that Bones 10 had finally been identified. Her name was Wendy Stevens. She was 14 years old when she ran away from her home in Denver, Colorado in 1983. Her remains had been found in a swampy area near SeaTac the following year, but her identity had remained unknown for nearly 4 decades. Wendy had been everybody's dream of a kid before her life took darker turns, according to her mother Cecile Gaspar. The teenager had adjusted well when the family moved to a Denver suburb, had been happy and engaged. But somewhere along the way, things had changed. She began acting out, struggled with the transition to adolescence, and eventually ran away from home. The family had searched for her. They had filed missing persons reports, had hoped and waited for some word. But Wendy had simply vanished, and the years had passed without answers. What they did not know, what they could not have known, was that their daughter had made her way to Seattle, had ended up on the streets there, had encountered a man in a pickup truck who seemed ordinary and safe. They did not know that she had become the youngest confirmed victim of the Green River Killer. The breakthrough came through genetic genealogy, a technique that barely existed when Ridgway was arrested. Volunteers from the DNA Doe Project extracted genetic material from bone fragments and uploaded the results to genealogy databases, searching for distant relatives who might lead them to the victim's identity. The DNA Doe Project is staffed largely by volunteers, amateur genealogists, who have dedicated themselves to giving names back to the unknown dead. They work case by case, building family trees, searching for connections, following genetic breadcrumbs that might lead to an identification. For many of them, it is a calling as much as a hobby. As it turned out, one of Wendy Stevens's parents had uploaded their own DNA to the genealogy site GE Deadmatch in 2019, hoping to learn what had happened to their daughter after all those years. But due to a change in the site's privacy policy, that DNA had been opted out of law enforcement searches without the parents' knowledge. The match that could have immediately solved the case was invisible to investigators. The irony was heartbreaking. A parent had taken a DNA test, specifically hoping to find their missing child. But a technical policy change had made that match invisible. For months, investigators and the parent were in the same system, separated only by a privacy setting that neither fully understood. It took months of additional work to find other relatives and build out family trees until the connection was finally made. "Every person needs their name," said forensic anthropologist Catherine Taylor, who had worked on the case. Wendy again has hers. The identification brought closure of a sort, but also fresh grief. How can anybody wrap their head around their daughter being killed by a serial killer, her mother asked. It was a question that had no answer. That perhaps could have no answer. Some losses are simply too vast to comprehend. 2 more identifications followed. In December 2023, Bone 17 was identified as Lori Ann Raspotnik, a 15-year-old who had run away from her Lewis County home in 1982. Her mother, Donna Hurley, had spent decades wondering what happened to her daughter. Lori's remains had been found on the 30th of December, 1985, when Auburn City employees, investigating a car that had gone over an embankment near Mountain View Cemetery, stumbled upon human bones. Further searching revealed a second set of remains nearby. They were labeled Bone 16 and Bone 17 and entered into the growing catalog of unidentified Green River victims. In 2002, when Ridgway was cooperating with investigators, he had led them to the same area and admitted placing 2 victims there. He provided some details about the crimes, but could not or would not identify the victims by name. He claimed not to remember faces, not to have known who most of his victims were. The identification of Bone 16 came in 2012 when DNA testing matched the remains to 20-year-old Sandra Majors. But Bone 17 remained unknown for another 11 years. The breakthrough came when a DNA test from an ancestry service taken by Hurley's granddaughter was uploaded to a genealogy database. Parabon Nanolabs, a forensic company specializing in genetic genealogy, was able to build a DNA profile from the remains and identify potential relatives. Hurley provided a saliva sample and the University of North Texas confirmed the match. One of the last conversations Hurley recalled having with Lori before she ran away was an argument. "You don't love me," Lori had said. It was the kind of ordinary mother-daughter conflict that happens in families everywhere. But it was one of the last exchanges they would ever have. Hurley had tried tough love when Lori kept running away. This was her 10th or 12th time, and Hurley was hoping her daughter would eventually come home on her own. She hired a private investigator. She reached out to friends in law enforcement. She never stopped looking, even as years became decades, and hope faded into resignation. "I thought to myself it wouldn't surprise me if Lori was one of the victims," Hurley said. For 40 years that fear had lived alongside the hope that perhaps somehow Lori was still alive somewhere. In January 2024, the final known victim was identified. Bones 20 belonged to Tammy Lyles, who was 17 when she disappeared. A separate set of Lyles's remains had been found in Oregon in 1985 and identified from dental records in 1988, but the remains found in King County had never been connected to her until advanced DNA testing made the link. All 49 of Gary Ridgway's confirmed victims now had names. It's an immense feeling of satisfaction that in this case that started in the early 80s, we are able to identify all of Gary Ridgway's victims, said King County Sheriff's spokesperson Eric White. All 49 of them. The statement carried a weight that only those involved in the investigation could fully appreciate. For more than 4 decades, detectives and forensic scientists and volunteers had worked to solve these cases. They had faced setbacks and frustrations, had watched as DNA technology evolved from a curiosity to a forensic miracle. They had outlasted the killer himself in determination, if not in years. But the story does not end with identification. As of late 2024, rumors circulated that Ridgway, now 75 years old, was in declining health and potentially near death. In September 2024, he was unexpectedly transferred from the Washington State Penitentiary in Walla Walla to the King County Jail in Seattle, marking his first time in the city in 21 years. The transfer shocked victims' families, who had not been notified in advance. For many, seeing Ridgway's name in the news again dredged up old wounds. The trauma of his crimes had never fully healed. The reason for the transfer was eventually revealed. Ridgway had told detectives he could help them find the remains of additional victims in King County. Whether this was genuine cooperation or another manipulation remained unclear. He had a history of promising information and then failing to deliver, of playing games with investigators, even from behind bars. Court documents unsealed in March 2025 confirmed that the transfer was related to ongoing investigative efforts. Ridgway was returned to Walla Walla after a few days, leaving observers to wonder what, if anything, had been accomplished. Former Sheriff Dave Reichert, now retired from Congress, reflected on what the killer's death might mean. "Let's really think about the victims and the families, and the impact that one human being left on those families," Reichert said. He ripped their loved ones from their homes and their lives. Reichert had devoted much of his career to the Green River case. He had been there at the beginning, when the first bodies were found in 1982. He had pushed to reopen the case when he became sheriff in 1997. He had been present when Ridgway finally confessed. More than any other figure in the investigation, Reichert embodied the persistence that eventually brought the killer to justice. But even Reichert acknowledged that the case had never been fully resolved. "There are still 3 missing persons that are on the official Green River list, along with a number of other unsolved cases in Washington state," he noted. "Some of those cases might be connected to Ridgway. Others might not. The uncertainty persisted. Reichert noted that the case is not entirely closed. There are still missing women whose cases may be connected to Ridgway. When confronted about whether he was being truthful in his ongoing communications with investigators, Ridgway had started to answer, and then stopped mid-sentence, unable or unwilling to complete the thought. "I think that Ridgway will take a lot of secrets to the grave with him," Reichert said. The statement reflects a frustrating truth about cases like this. Even after capture, even after confession, even after decades in prison, serial killers often retain knowledge they never share. They hold back information as a final form of control, a way of maintaining power over those who want answers. Ridgway's secrets, whatever they are, may die with him. For the families, Ridgway's death, when it comes, will offer no real closure. The women he killed have been gone for more than 40 years now. Their children have grown up without mothers. Their parents have aged and died, still grieving. The trauma has been passed down through generations, resurfacing every time a news story brings the case back into public attention. Current King County prosecuting attorney Lisa Mannion, invoking her late mentor, Norm Malling, who negotiated Ridgway's 2003 plea deal, summarized the official position on Ridgway's declining health. What Norm would say is that Gary Ridgway is not deserving of our sympathy. He is not deserving of our thoughts. Norm would want us to focus on the victims. He would want us to think of their family members. These women were someone's daughter, sister, child. They were loved. The statement captured an important truth. The Green River case was never really about Gary Ridgway. He was a mediocre man, an unremarkable truck painter, someone who would have passed through life completely unnoticed, if not for the horrors he committed. The case was about the 49 women whose lives he stole, and about the families and communities left to pick up the pieces. A woman named Susan, who believes she narrowly escaped, becoming Ridgway's 16th victim in 1983, has carried the weight of survival for 4 decades. Her friend Sandra Major got into Ridgway's truck that night, despite Susan's desperate pleas. "She kept telling me, 'It'll be fine, I'll be right back,'" Susan recalled. "And I said, 'Don't go, something's wrong.' And she went anyway, and she never came back that night." Susan described Sandra's dreams. She wanted to go to college. She wanted to be a mother. She wanted to be free of the life that she had found herself in because of a very sick man who convinced her into it. And she will never have that chance now. The hard part is those families don't get the heads up of when it might come on the news. McNerthney told Seattle's Morning News on Kiro News Radio, "There are probably people listening right now who are affected by his cases, and it rattles them big time, understandably so. What remains is not justice, not really, but something closer to remembrance." The Green River case changed how law enforcement approaches serial crimes, particularly the importance of preserving biological evidence and the value of maintaining cold case units. But it also exposed deeper issues that persist today: the marginalization of certain victims, the biases that can derail investigations, the way society's attention is distributed unevenly among those who disappear. The victims were people who went through hardships and had goals, social lives, and people who cared about them, observed one researcher who studied the case. "But when I thought back to my childhood, I did not remember hearing them described as such. Instead, the language often implied that these women had somehow brought their fates upon themselves. Bad girls, prostitutes, runaways. As if those labels explained everything, as if they justified looking the other way. The truth is more complicated and more painful. These were daughters, sisters, mothers, friends. Wendy Caulfield was a troubled teenager, looking for love she never found at home. Deborah Bonner called her parents regularly to tell them she loved them. Marcia Chapman was a single mother trying to feed 3 children. Marie Malvar was outgoing and trusting, loved by her family, ambitious, despite the circumstances that had led her to the streets. Wendy Stevens, the youngest confirmed victim, had been everybody's dream of a kid. How can anybody wrap their head around their daughter being killed by a serial killer? Her mother asked when the identification was finally made. The answer perhaps is that no one can. The enormity of what happened, the scale of the loss, the decades of waiting and uncertainty, all of it exceeds what the human heart is designed to contain. And yet the families endured. They searched and waited and grieved, and sometimes forgave. They kept photos in wallets and celebrated birthdays with pieces of cake. They submitted DNA samples, hoping for answers that took 40 years to arrive. They refused to let their loved ones be forgotten, even when the rest of the world moved on. The Green River case is often discussed in terms of Gary Ridgway. His methods, his psychology, how he evaded capture for so long. But that framing centers the wrong person. This was never his story. It belonged to the 49 women whose lives he took, and to the families who have spent decades trying to reclaim their memories from the shadow he cast over them. Today, the Green River flows through King County much as it did in 1982. The slaughterhouses are mostly gone, replaced by warehouses and strip malls. The SeaTac Strip has changed, but not disappeared. Somewhere in the woods and fields of South King County, there may still be remains that have never been found. Women who disappeared and were never reported missing, whose names will never be known. The investigation continues even now. The King County Sheriff's Office maintains an active unit dedicated to Green River cases, still following leads, still hoping to bring answers to families who have waited too long already. If you have information that might help in the investigation, they ask that you contact them. Call between 7 a.m. and 3 p.m. to speak with a detective. If after hours, leave a voicemail. After more than 4 decades, someone is still listening. Some people ask themselves what could have been different. Whether any of these deaths might have been prevented if investigators had pursued different leads, if the polygraph had never been trusted, if the paint evidence had been tested, if the Malvar family's tip had been taken more seriously. The answer is almost certainly yes. Some of these women might still be alive if the system had worked differently. But the system is made of people, and people make mistakes. What matters now is not assigning blame but learning from those mistakes, ensuring that future investigations are better resourced, more thorough, less likely to dismiss victims based on who they were or how they lived. The Green River case taught law enforcement the importance of DNA evidence preservation, of cold case units, of treating every victim with equal urgency regardless of background. These lessons came at a terrible cost. They should not be forgotten. For those who lived through this era in the Pacific Northwest, the memory remains vivid. The fear that settled over the region in the early 1982s, the endless news reports about bodies found, the sense that a monster was out there somewhere hunting. It's not something you forget, even when the monster is finally caught. The women who died deserved better. They deserved protection that never came, attention that was diverted elsewhere, a system that valued their lives as much as it would have valued others. The investigation that followed their deaths was flawed and frustrating, marked by failures that allowed the killing to continue far longer than it should have. But it was also marked by perseverance, by detectives like Tom Jensen who refused to give up even when resources dwindled and leads went cold. Jensen had been the one to finally submit the DNA evidence that cracked the case. He had kept the faith when others had moved on. By families like the Malvars, who tracked a killer's truck to his own house years before anyone else would believe them. Jose Malvar had done what the police could not, had identified the killer's address through sheer determination and a father's love. By forensic scientists and genealogists and volunteers who spent decades working to give nameless victims back their identities. Catherine Taylor, the forensic anthropologist who worked for years on the unidentified victims, described what the work meant to her. Not only did he take her life, she said of one victim, but he took her name. Restoring that name even decades later was a form of justice that the courts could never provide. The DNA Doe Project volunteers, who helped identify Wendy Stevens, Lori Ann Razpotnik, and Tammy Lyles, worked without pay, driven by a conviction that every person deserves to be known. They built family trees from fragments of genetic data, searched databases, made cold calls to distant relatives, all in service of the dead and the families who mourned them. These efforts mattered. They continue to matter, because every person needs their name. The roster of victims reads like a roll call of lives cut short, of potential never realized, of families forever changed. Some names are now familiar to anyone who has followed the case. Others remain known only to their loved ones. All of them deserve to be remembered, not as victims of a serial killer, but as the individuals they were before that terrible label was attached to them. Wendy Lee Caulfield was a 16-year-old who struggled with a difficult home life and ended up on the streets too young. She liked James jeans and had a complicated relationship with her mother. She deserved better than she got from life. Giselle Ann Lovorn was 17, described by those who knew her as someone who went out to turn tricks but should have been in school. She disappeared on the 17th of July, 1982, and was found that September. Deborah Lynn Bonner, 23, drove a maroon Thunderbird and called her mother to say she was class all the way, her brother said. Marcia Faye Chapman was a single mother of 3 who refused to work with a pimp, maintaining her independence, even in circumstances that offered little. Her mother reported her missing with the words, "Good mother." Cynthia Jean Hines, 17, was known as Cookie. She had been working since she was 14, had dropped out of school, had a family that cared and loved her, even though they couldn't save her. Opal Charmaine Mills was 16. They died within days of each other. Their bodies left in the same stretch of river. The list continues. Terry Renee Milligan, Mary Bridget Meehan, Deborah Lorraine Estes, Linda Jane Rule, Denise Darcel Bush, Shonda Leah Summers, Shirley Marie Sherrill, Rebecca Marrero, Colleen Renee Brockman, Sandra Denise Major, Alma Ann Smith, Dolores Laverne Williams, Gail Lynn Matthews, Andrea Marion Childers, Sandra K. Gabbert, Kimmy Kai Pitzor, Marie Malvar, Carol Ann Christensen, Martina Teresa Otherly, Cheryl Lee Wims, Yvonne Shelley Antosh, Carrie Ann Royce, Constance Elizabeth Nayon, Kelly Marie Ware, Tina Marie Thompson, April Dawn Buttram, Debbie Mae Abernathy, Tracy Ann Winston, Maureen Sue Feeney, Mary Sue Bello, Pammy Annette Avent, Delise Louise Plager, Kimberly L. Nelson, Lisa Lorraine Yates, Mary Exetta West, Cindy Ann Smith, Patricia Michelle Barchak, Roberta Joseph Hayes, Marta Reeves, Patricia Yellowrobe, Wendy Stevens, Lori Ann Razpotnik, Tammy Lyles. 49 names, 49 lives cut short, 49 families forever changed. Each name represents a person who laughed and cried, who had favorite foods and songs, who loved and was loved in return. Each name represents a mother or daughter or sister or friend whose absence left a hole that could never be filled. Each name represents a story that ended too soon. The circumstances that led these women to the SeaTac Strip were varied and complex. Some came from stable homes and fell into difficult circumstances. Others had faced hardship from the beginning. Some turned to sex work out of desperation. Others were manipulated by boyfriends or pimps who took advantage of their youth and vulnerability. None of them deserved what happened to them. Whatever choices they made, whatever circumstances they faced, they were human beings whose lives had value. The fact that some in society viewed them as disposable, as somehow less worthy of protection, was a moral failure that enabled a predator to operate for 2 decades. The Green River case forced a reckoning with that failure, at least partially. It exposed the ways in which certain victims are prioritized over others, the ways in which societal biases can influence investigations, the ways in which the most vulnerable among us are often the least protected. These lessons should not be forgotten. In the years since Ridgway's conviction, advocacy for victims of the sex trade has grown more sophisticated and more visible. Organizations work to provide support for women trying to leave prostitution. Law enforcement agencies have developed protocols for treating all victims with equal dignity, regardless of their backgrounds. The language used to describe these women has shifted, at least in some circles. These changes came too late for the 49 women Ridgway killed. But they might make a difference for others who find themselves in similar circumstances today. The Green River case demonstrated with terrible clarity what happens when a society looks away from its most vulnerable members. That demonstration cost 49 lives. The least we can do is learn from it. The investigation also transformed how law enforcement approaches serial crimes. The importance of preserving biological evidence, even when current technology cannot analyze it, became a standard practice. Cold case units became more common, staffed by detectives who specialize in revisiting unsolved crimes with fresh eyes and new techniques. The Green River Task Force itself became a model for better and worse of how to organize a massive investigation. If there is a case you think deserves to be told, you can share it. These stories matter not because of the killers who committed the crimes, but because of the people whose lives were taken and the loved ones who remember them still. The Green River continues to flow through King County, indifferent to the history that unfolded along its banks. The water carries no memory of the bodies that were found there, no awareness of the lives that ended in its murky depths. Rivers move forward, always forward toward the sea and oblivion. But memory persists. In the families who still gather on birthdays and anniversaries to remember daughters and sisters who never came home. In the investigators who devoted years of their lives to solving the case. In the volunteers who worked to give names back to the nameless dead. In the community that lived through those years of fear and has never entirely forgotten what it felt like. 49 women. 49 names. 49 stories that ended too soon. They deserve to be remembered, not as victims, not as statistics, not as entries in a case file. They deserve to be remembered as the people they were. Daughters, sisters, mothers, friends. Human beings who mattered, whose absence left holes in the lives of everyone who loved them. The Green River case is closed officially. The killer was caught. The victims have been identified. Justice, such as it is, has been served. But the ripples continue to spread through families and communities and institutions, through the decades that have passed and the decades yet to come. Some stories never really end. They just keep echoing, waiting to be heard, hoping that someone will remember, that someone will learn, that someone will do better next time. These stories matter. These women mattered. They still do.